I'm Michael Craine, one of the directors at Cranfield. We're a manufacturer of artist paints and printmaking inks.
I'm Paul Lee, and I'm the technical director at Cranfield, working alongside Michael.
We're here in the Jackson studio to look at the subject of how we use artist materials in the studio in a safe and appropriate way.
Toxicity is the ability of a substance to cause harm to the body or cells in the body. I guess we often can imagine it as being only the very severe. We picture maybe nuclear waste or something terrible, but in reality, every substance is toxic, even water. We're really talking about how potent a substance may be, or the level of exposure, the dose that we're going to be receiving of that substance. So water is very weak in its potency, so you'd have to have a large dosage in order to make a difference. Something like arsenic is very potent, and only a small amount can have a big impact on the human body.
You've explained what toxicity is. When somebody hears the term carcinogenic, what do they mean by that, and what kind of risk are they talking about there?
Carcinogenic is a subset of toxicity. It's the set that means it can cause cancer. So it's a very specific area within toxicity itself.
And before we move from the dictionary into the studio, there's probably a few other terms that we should explore. Another pair that we often hear together, something may be chronic, a chronic problem produced by a hazardous material, and an acute phase. So what do the differences mean there?
When we're talking about acute, we're really looking at effects on the body that tend to come in quite quickly, are short-lived, may be severe or mild, but probably a good example, Michael, would be drinking alcohol. When we first consume it, it's causing dizziness. We all know the change in mood if you've tried it, and of course the hangover the next day. Short-term, goes away the following day, and most of the time doesn't cause a long-lasting effect.
So we could stick with alcohol, and you've described the acute effect the morning after, how you feel, but it also has the capacity as a harmful substance to cause long-term chronic damage to the liver. The things that happen in an acute phase can quite often be recovered from, but chronic tends to lay down real long-term harm.
Chronic also could be from a relatively few number of exposures, but most frequently is from steady repeated exposure to a substance.
If we travel now into the studio, we could think of an example of lead. It's a pigment that is taken into the body, and the body can't digest it. It's not able to get rid of it, and slowly and perniciously it has over the years been responsible for great harm and poisoning, and remains one of the greatest dangers in the studio if mishandled.
Most chronic symptoms that you're going to experience are going to come from a repeated and regular dosage of something, and solvents, if you're using them regularly, then they are going to have that effect in the long run.
There are 4 significant routes that a substance can enter the body and cause harm. The first is when we breathe it, that's known as respiration. The second is ingestion, when we eat something. The third is when it enters us through the skin, and the fourth is through the eye. 2 terms we might like to consider. One is hazard and the other is harm. And it's possible for something to present an environmental hazard, but for us naively and wrongly to think that it isn't a harm to us. Well, if something is explosive, well, actually it will be harmful to us. And so that's why care of ourselves and our studio is linked with care of the environment, both the natural environment and our own working environment. Now that can be influenced by very practical things, such as putting the lid back on tins. You'll save the product, which is saving you cash, but it's also saving the solvent leaving, which again presents a hazard of its own, and it also prevents that remaining product in the tin going solid and sending far too soon to landfill waste product, which could have lived to paint another day. Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about flammable risks and about explosive risks? Because things as innocuous as flour can be explosive when they're in a dust form. So in the average studio, with relatively small quantities, how should they best be stored?
Well, the first place to look is on the label to see if there's any risk of your substance being flammable or explosive. If it's flammable or if it's explosive, then you need to consider where you're going to store your material. You should ideally be putting your flammable materials into a steel cabinet that can be locked so that those children, for example, could not gain entry to it.
What about things such as rags, those used to contain or mop up linseed? They're a risk, I understand.
Yeah, so linseed is exothermic. That means it's going to generate heat as it cures and reacts with oxygen. When you have a rag full of linseed oil, it just means the amount of heat that's generated could potentially cause the rags to smoulder and maybe even catch fire. So ideally, you're going to put those in a metal bin too. You'd have a lid on that metal bin, and you'd avoid excessive amounts of rags building up in those bins as well.
Terms that you might be familiar with already if you're in a shared space are COSH, which stands for Control of Substances Hazardous to Health, and also a risk assessment. Now, if you're working alone, a risk assessment may seem really an overkill, but I suggest that it's not, and it may simply be something that you think through. What are the risks in this environment? How can I best store my materials? How can I protect myself? And how can I protect others?
So depending on your individual circumstances, there may be different people involved in writing a COSH assessment. Of course, if it's your own private studio and you want to do one, and you're the only one in there, then you're writing the COSH assessment. Larger companies or institutions may have somebody dedicated to that task, whereby they're going to have to research the information, research the products, and read the safety data sheets in order to write a COSH assessment that's going to, as you've already mentioned, tell you where you need to be storing materials, how it should be stored, the conditions involved, who could have access or not, and what to do in emergency situations.
And this is linked in a way, when one is making these assessments, to the exposure levels that are going to be likely. I remember many years ago at the time of the Chernobyl disaster that there was a risk that milk produced in the UK could contain high levels of radioactive potency, and it was calculated that one would feel an ill effect from such milk if you consumed over 40 pints a day. So I think illustrative of the fact that actually there is, with all of these things, a risk context, how the product is being used, how much you're exposed to it, and the length of that exposure. All of these form part of the calculation and the risk assessment that needs to be made with each product and substance that you use in the studio.
Yeah, and ultimately, what actions we need to take. So understanding the problem to then putting in place the actions that need to be taken.
Let's start with thinking of the irritation that we can cause to our skin, and how do we protect our skins? I suppose most obviously our hands.
That the hands are going to be exposed to most of the substances in the studio, but don't forget your arms if it's the summer and you're wearing t-shirts, or indeed your face if you're using materials that may splash, or indeed if you're spraying materials, for example. So keep your skin covered or protected. You really need to read the label. That's going to give you some guidance on whether gloves are being recommended, whether a barrier cream might be suitable. But ultimately, anything that's going to create a gap of separation from your skin and the substance you're using, Michael.
Now, I know most painters will be up in arms at that. I can't wear gloves when I'm painting, and we do appreciate that. So it is important that you wear a cream which isn't going to wash off instantly every time you wash your hands. But if the label says that something has the capacity to cause a respiratory irritant, what do we do to overcome that?
So firstly, we're really going to have to get some ventilation and get some air changes going through the room. That can be something simple like opening a window, opening a door, or it could be as complicated as getting extraction fans put in to make sure that we're dragging fresh air from outside into the room. The idea there is you really want some air flow. You want the air moving from one place to the next, and you really should consider about where you set yourself up painting. So if you're using a hazardous solvent, then ideally you want to be where the air is exiting the room so that you're not dragging it through to anybody else who might also be there.
Now, solvents, it is perfectly true to say, will, depending on their density, will pool. So is that a particular phenomena that we should be aware of? Now, you've mentioned that a door or a window left open will help with that, but is it a particular risk? Is the risk worst at the floor or the ceiling, or are we getting a bit hung up on this? Using your hierarchy, should we prevent that in the first place?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we do get a little hung up on it. Simple movements through the room will disturb almost any solvent and spread it throughout the room quite considerably. Maybe over long periods overnight, you may see some settlement towards the floor. But the moment you open that door again, it all is going to whisk back up. Once we have the ventilation covered, we can move on to masks and personal protection equipment, which can physically stop any dusts or aerosols going into the lungs.
And it's also worth saying that the label and the SDS sheet will have been produced with common uses of substances in mind. We also need to make sure that we don't add to the problem by, for example, thinking of smoking when handling products. A cigarette can get up to, I think, 900 degrees centigrade at the tip. So if you have a chemical on your hand which is not known to give anything other than a mild risk, but you get it on your cigarette and then you take it into your lung at such superheated temperature, of course there are risks there that are perhaps unimagined. So we need to be careful that we're using these substances carefully. And I would suggest avoid smoking in the studio.
Yeah, and to add to that, Michael, avoid eating in the studio. Another route into your body is through ingestion. So if you have paint on your hands or any substance on your hands that's toxic, that might get onto your food and your packaging, and if you're consuming the food, that's going to get into your body and cause problems. So I think the message maybe is to wash your hands regularly and certainly give yourself some time after coming out of the studio before eating.
So we've discussed how we breathe, how we take care of our skin, how we are watching what we take through our gut. Finally, the eye. How do we protect the eye?
So the eyes are going to need to be protected by safety glasses, and the type of safety glass can be found quite often in the safety data sheet, but also you have to consider how you're using a material. So, for example, if you're using something that has the ability, so if you were spraying and you have aerosol that might get around the side of a conventional glass, you need to be wearing goggles.
And again, for many painters, this will seem as a tremendous barrier to your creativity, but it is using the most sensible protective method, the PPE, the personal protective equipment, to protect yourself in that moment of risk. And as we've said before, always read the label because it'll point in the right direction. Thinking of other risks that one may expose oneself to, almost absent-mindedly in the studio, another one is licking a brush. What is your view before you've even painted? Sometimes people like to lick a brush to soften it. Is it good practice?
It's not good practice. We've already mentioned one of the routes into the body is through ingestion. If you're using any toxic substance and you're on a daily basis, even a small quantity, a tiny amount on that brush, and you're using it on a daily or even hourly basis into the body, it's not good for you. So that should certainly be avoided.
Yeah.
So the hierarchy of control is talking about the steps we can take when we're considering our toxic substances. The first thing on that list is do we need to use the product at all? So in some cases, actually, we don't need to use a product. It's just helpful or habit.
So we could substitute it with something which is less harmful. If we say that simply isn't possible, what do we then need to do?
Yeah, so there's certain engineering controls we can take. So we need to set up isolation for people. We don't want to be exposing others in the studio to your toxic materials. So walls, curtains, boards, and of course, maybe even choosing the time of day that you're using your toxic substance to avoid unnecessary exposure. You can move on from that and start thinking about how you can ventilate and create more airflow that takes the toxic substance away and minimises exposure to people.
And I suppose with respiratory irritants, it's all well and good the person who's sanding back the primer to be wearing a mask if those around them in the studio are not. So that would be an example where one could provide a physical, either a sign or a particular dedicated area or a fume cupboard, something like that, so that only those that are trained and authorised and are actually fulfilling that task, and not only are they protected, but other people are kept away. And if we've gone through all of those and then we still need to use PPE, we use them aware that we've gone through this questioning hierarchy.
Absolutely. So if we go back to the label, you may very well see the statement, consult your physician or consult your doctor. Michael, what might we be looking for from that statement?
Well, clearly, if you're pregnant, or indeed if there's something else that makes you particularly susceptible to harm, but also because we're all so very different. We're different in age, we're different in metabolism, the way that our bodies deal with food, we're different in our weights, we're different in our general tolerances. And no more is this clearly displayed in the way that we may be allergic to something. Allergies and the way we respond takes us into this area that one can have a reaction to something which actually isn't harmful, but it can have an effect upon us.
Yeah, I can actually think somebody I work with is quite sensitive to moisturisers, which quite often have these materials in that don't affect most of us, but certain individuals might pick up a certain sensitivity. Maybe you've experienced that as well. Outside of moisturiser, if we look into the studio, there may be something like the most water-based materials will contain fungicides and biocides, and they can often trigger warnings about allergic reactions or sensitivities.
Another example would be turpentine. Now, we know there are risks associated with turpentine. It's a solvent and a natural solvent, but nonetheless can have harmful effect. And some are so sensitive that they will get a headache or a response like that from minute parts per million in the atmosphere. And so one needs to be aware that that's a harmful response. The body is fighting the fact that it perceives there's something invading.
A threat.
And a threat is there, and that's the way that it responds.
And what should you expect if you're pregnant, Michael?
Well, ultimately, you should expect a baby, probably. But that aside, you should clearly be taking care, and labels will often point out there's a rather alarming phrase, mutagenic, which means that it can actually affect the development of a child in the womb. So such information, if one sees on the label that it's not suitable for pregnant women, then it needs to be taken seriously. And during pregnancy, there are obviously even more reasons than usual to make sure that the expectant mother protects herself from those 4 risks that we've discussed earlier.
Okay.
I'd like to talk through those symbols, those pictograms that are evident on any product that has a risk. The first is the skull and crossbones. These are not possibly might be, but will be fatal if swallowed, that kind of thing. And they should not be really in any studio. There's no justification to have any product that has a skull and crossbones. The next one down from that is the exploding lung. It's a rather grim-looking pictogram. What's that telling us, Paul?
These are talking about pretty serious effects to the body. That might be damage to your organs or effects that are long-term and chronic. You'll see the word danger, and it will clearly define what the warning is on the label.
The next one down from that is corrosive, again harmful, but less to organs and more to skin. The pictogram is a product being poured from a test tube, and you can see it's corroding away the material that's been poured onto. So these are health risks and telling us that products need to be treated with caution. The next pictogram that we may encounter is the picture of the dead fish and the withered tree. These indicate environmental risks that can come from the product, and they tell us that we need to treat it with caution, and we need to make sure that we don't send any effluent or waste into the watercourse or into the environment more generally.
There's a flammable pictogram, which is a flame inside a red diamond, and that's telling us the product is flammable, and it'll have the warning words along the lines of extremely flammable or highly flammable.
So these pictograms are there to give you information as to how you should safely use the product. Now, for all of these symbols, there ought to be on the label, if it's a reputable product from a good supplier, it'll have the bullet points of the information that you need to know so you can handle this substance carefully. If you want to look further, you can go in search of the Chemical Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS sheet, and that'll give a full in-depth description of how the product should be used. The SDS or MSDS tends to be of more interest to the technician, for example, in a college or university setting, and in truth, they're normally kept in a filing cabinet a long way from the user, because some of the information also affects things like how the product should be stored, whether it's flammable or explosive. And so the SDS sheet, it is there, but it is in full detail, but the label is the place that gives you the information that you need to know as to how you use the product today. We've been stressing the importance of reading the label and reading the SDS sheet, but there'll be terms on there perhaps that we're unfamiliar with, or we just need to remind ourselves exactly what they mean. The first may be flash point. A product may have a flash point, a temperature next to it, but what does that mean?
The flash point is the temperature of the substance at which, if exposed to a spark, it could ignite.
Another term you may come across is LEV, which simply stands for local exhaust ventilation. That means what mechanism is in place to move the air. And you perhaps have seen that in larger studios, a system perhaps bringing ductwork over a fume cupboard. Another term I want to ask you, Paul, what does TWA mean when we see it in the context of a risk assessment or an MSDS?
TWA, we see that in the safety data sheet especially. You may also say CSTEL. So TWA is a time-weighted average. It's talking about the average exposure over a period of time in which you might be exposed to a substance. And often it'll give you a quantity in that box and tell you how much of a material in the air is going to have a harmful effect on your body.
You may see the term hydrocarbon. Predominantly solvents, these are simply derivatives from the mineral oil industry. You may be familiar from a tin of paint or a tube, the terms VOC. What does that stand for, Paul?
That stands for volatile organic compound, and it's talking about the substances within your material that can evaporate out.
And some of the risks that remain are there perhaps because we approach products which still have an inherent danger, but we approach them in a careless way. One would be those products that are safer or described as non-toxic, but may still be harmful. Perhaps an example you might want to talk us through, Paul, are those solvents that are based on fruit or vegetable, or at least contain fruit and vegetable, that are perhaps used rather carelessly in the studio. Why is that a risk?
Well, I'd say with any substance that you should always take general precautions anyway. So if all of your materials are as far as you know, no hazard or low hazard, then it's never going to be a bad thing to wear gloves, wear eye protection, wear barrier cream, have windows open, and take measures just to limit the amount of exposure you may have. So first and foremost, treat everything suspiciously. Secondly, solvents will have an inherent danger. They always have a risk of getting into your lungs, and so the best precaution there is to avoid them at all costs, no matter how friendly they may claim to be. Reduce your risk.
And any solvent worth its weight will actually do the job required to act as a solvent, and that means it also removes the skin's natural protection. So these products are not wrong or dangerous per se, but they need to be understood and respected that they still remain solvents.
Some of you may have noticed that labels have different warning statements depending on which part of the world they're in. Michael, what do you think?
Well, it's worth saying that whilst toxicology is an exact science, the regulation is not. And so in different countries around the world, they will have a different angle on what is required on the label to fulfill their regulatory laws that they have in that particular country. So, for example, in California, you will see dire warnings on a product that you do not see elsewhere. Well, it's an identical product, but it simply looks at the way that the court systems work in these countries, and indeed how they have chosen, until they have definite evidence, how to label something.
So this is not the result of California being more dangerous than other parts of the world?
No, it is not.
Okay.
But you may have seen greater use of the term may cause, and whatever the risk may be, and that will be perhaps on occasions to protect themselves from litigation themselves, or indeed because there simply isn't evidence that something is safe, and so these risk clauses are used. But again, looking at the labels, we can see various other standards that the product may carry. So, for example, the products that we sell into the States have the ACMI logo. It doesn't tell you that you can eat it or bath in it or do anything else, rub it into your skin, but it does tell you that it's been analysed. Now, this is your field. What does ACMI stand for? Who are they? And what do they tell the user?
Well, ACMI stands for the Art and Creative Materials Institute. And what the ACMI do is they assign a toxicologist to look into the material and identify any toxic or harmful materials in it. What they do above the regular regulation is they look into acute reactions that their substance may cause, as well as the chronic. They require us to label very clearly what the risks are, and they come up with 2 seals for it, Michael.
AP and CL?
You've got it. So the AP is the approved product, and the CL is cautionary labelling. So they're principally saying AP, they've assessed it, they don't consider there to be a particular risk with that material, and with CL, they consider that there is some cautions that should be taking place, and they'll detail what those cautions are.
And so when we see CL, it's yet another reminder, read the label. So let's start talking practically, Paul, about the average studio. What in there is producing vapour? What's producing gas? What's producing solvent?
Yeah, if we start with solvents, probably the most obvious is your cleaning solvents, things like white spirits and turpentine. If we go beyond that, we might consider materials, typically paints, that might contain either of those products. So alkyd primers might be a classic example of that, or some of the more economic or entry-level paints in the market might be cut with a solvent like white spirit.
Okay. What about spray cans?
Ideally, we need to focus on ventilation and keep the concentration as low in the air as possible. If we still feel that the concentration is high, then an organic vapor mask is what's needed. Dust masks aren't going to protect you from solvents. They might look like they're covering your mouth and nose, but the solvent particle is so small, they're going to travel straight through and into your lungs. Once it's in the lungs, then you may have some damage directly to the lungs, but more likely actually it's going to go through into your bloodstream. Once it's in the bloodstream, it's going to travel around your whole body, and it can get into the brain, and that's where we can start feeling lightheaded. Things like nausea might start coming into effect, and you're generally going to feel quite uncomfortable.
Let's spend a moment thinking about acrylics. For the last 50 years, really, since their development, have always been seen as the Cinderella product which presents the risk to no one. Is that true?
There's a common tendency to consider anything water-based to be somehow free of any risk or any problem. Generally speaking, water-based materials like acrylics, they do have to have biocides and fungicides.
Why do they have to have those?
And those are going to help prevent the development of fungus or bacteria in the product. Some of you may have even seen in products when you've opened them, if they've been on the shelf for a good many years, you might find fungus on the top of, or bacterial culture on the top of your acrylic paint. So they have to be prevented some way, and the materials to do that could cause you some sensitivity. For the most part, as manufacturers, we'll always try and reduce that to the minimum amount required to have the antifungal effect.
And acrylic paints, which for such a long period were really unquestioned, are now facing at least some challenges as we're becoming aware that as they're plastics, they need to be handled for the care of the environment too, not just the user.
Correct. We have to be really careful of how we handle our acrylics. They are a plastic, and when they're washed and diluted in water, the very small particles of plastic can get out into the watercourse and into our rivers and oceans, where these microplastics can then be consumed by the marine organisms that are out there. So how we handle our waste material is also very important. So that's from cleaning your brushes to your pots of dirty acrylic water that you finish with. If you're looking to dispose of products, contact your local waste authority and they'll give you guidance on the best way to do that.
Which is it best to paint? A big canvas in a small room or a small canvas in a big room? Do you want to expand on that? What's the size of the studio got to tell us, and what sort of extra care should we take?
Sure. I mean, when we're talking about toxic substances, then we're really talking about we'd prefer a big room. And that's for the simple reason that there's more air in that room, and that means the concentration in the air is less. We should all be looking at exactly how we're doing things. What are our circumstances? So if we're using a very small canvas in a very small room, then maybe we still need some ventilation. If we're using a very small canvas in a very large room, then the risk is far lower. Of course, the opposite would be really important for somebody. If you're having multiple large canvases being painted out, maybe primed, and you have a very small space for that, then you're at a high risk of starting to feel dizzy and being exposed to those toxic substances. And that's where good ventilation would be really paramount.
It's worth pointing out that no one watching this should feel terrified to go into the studio tomorrow, because many of the challenges that we've presented you're already dealing with, no doubt in a very sensible way. But it may well be that the label, or indeed the MSDS sheet too, don't answer all of your questions, because you uniquely know how you're going to use these products in your studio. And because you are unique, and because your questions may apply particularly to you in your situation, our advice is always to use good products from reputable suppliers. And don't be afraid to take your questions to them, so that you can make sure that you're using the product wisely and safely, you're protecting yourself and others that you share your studio space with. So please do bring your questions to us.